Hello, computer.
This is Hello Computer, a series of interviews carried out in 2023, at a time when artificial intelligence appears to be going everywhere all at once. Our next interview is with Alon Loeffler of Cortical Labs in Australia.
Hi everyone, my name's Alon Loeffler. I currently work in a startup in Melbourne, Australia called Cortical Labs, where they're growing neural tissue on microchips, human neural tissue. And I recently finished my PhD from the University of Sydney with Professor Zdenka Kuncic, looking at neuromorphic nanowire networks, which we will get into.
So you're interested in the intersection of psychology, neuroscience, nanotechnology, and philosophy. That's quite the combination in 2023. But can you tell us, how did that interest come about?
You know, anyone in this space should be interested in all these things. And you can take from any field inspiration. And I think a lot of my work has been doing that. But the way this came about is I initially was very interested in psychology at university. In my undergraduate studies, that was psychology. I actually signed up to a physics and maths degree and then dropped out after about a month because it was just too much for me at the time. But I wish I had done that now. But I'm glad that I decided to stick with psychology because it took me down the path of biological psychology and, you know, brain biology and brain stuff. And I did my honors in neuroscience. So in Australia, we have a year called honors, which is like a 1 year sprint research directed thesis, like a mini master's. And I did that at Monash University under the supervision of Professor Liu Cixin. He's a PhD student of Christopher Koch, who's quite well known in the field of neuroscience and consciousness specifically. And so a lot of these things, you know, consciousness and intelligence and these kind of questions of the biological, physical realization of these concepts was what really struck me as interesting. I also did philosophy in undergraduate as sort of like a fun secondary major, and I found that very, very helpful in forming my thinking patterns around this field, forming my writing as well. I think my writing is one of my greatest strengths because of philosophy, and that really helped that. After that, I sort of didn't really know where to go in life. I was really lost. I tried a few different pathways. I tried my own business. I did a clothing business, which was a ridiculous concept, but it was, you know, a fun time. I really didn't know what to do, but I was always really interested in technology and you know, the cutting edge. And so I threw out a bunch of emails to professors all over the world and sort of said, hey, I'm interested in what you're doing, would love to chat. And Zdenka Kuncic at the University of Sydney happened to reply and happened to say, hey, look, I'm doing this project on nanowire networks, neuromorphic nanowire networks. I'm coming at it from the angle of physics, but, you know, it's a brain-inspired system. That's what neuromorphics even means. Neuro from neurons, morphic, mimicking, copying. We need someone from the brain side of things, the neuroscience, the psychology, to really get this kicking. And, you know, I jumped on that opportunity and haven't looked back. And that's really what started my journey into this, or at least accelerated my journey into.
Can you explain what neuromorphics are in a nutshell?
Absolutely, I'd love to try. Neuromorphics, as I said, from the term neuron or neural and morphing, mimicking, copying. It's a branch of AI, electrical engineering, all sorts of fields, interdisciplinary branch, which the main goal behind neuromorphics is to re-inspire ourselves from the neurons and synapses in the human brain. So the initial inspiration for traditional AI models, machine learning models, the very simple perceptron, which you may be aware of, which is a simple, pretty much a one-layer machine learning model. It's the simplest model where all of our artificial neural networks have come from. That initially took inspiration from a neuron. It's actually quite similar to a neuron in how it works. But at some point we lost track of that inspiration, and we sort of saw that AI is really good at doing AI things, big data analysis, pattern recognition, things like that. But then we sort of said, wow, this is amazing. Let's dive into that. And it, all hell has broken loose in that space. And it's done amazing things, don't get me wrong. But we lost track of the initial inspiration. And so neuromorphics, the idea behind it is, well, at least my perception of what the point of neuromorphics is, can we go back to this brain-inspired thinking and this brain-inspired learning and take the things that make a brain useful and efficient and exciting and use it in non-biological systems? What other proponents of neuromorphics, or most people who are into neuromorphics, will say is the main reason they've chosen this field or believe in this field is because AI, as of now, is an incredibly power-hungry resource. It's an environmental catastrophe. The amount of energy required to train things like ChatGPT, these huge language models, or any AI machine learning system is staggering. Millions of dollars, so much energy required. And so, when you look at that and then you look at you and I, we do some pretty cool things from day to day, I'd like to say. Maybe we can't, find patterns in big data as well as AI can, but we do some pretty cool stuff with our brains. And we do that on, I think it's estimated 20 watts of power, 3 meals a day on average, if that even. There's some disconnect here between the amount of power used in AI and what, the brain can do. And so neuromorphics, the other inspiration behind neuromorphics is, can we take a step back and use the inspiration of the low power that the brain uses or biological systems use to inform our AI processes? And a lot of the neuromorphic systems, so devices, chips, wires, particles, lots of different systems, and we can get more into that in detail. That is the overarching goal, is to reduce the amount of power. So I think I started with my perspective and my goal in neuromorphics, and then I'd say the latter of what I described is what most people would be saying is the goal of neuromorphics.
Let's look at some of your work that you've recently published, which demonstrates that nanowire networks can exhibit short and long-term memory. Can you take us to that, please?
Yeah, so I think before we jump into that, explaining what nanowire networks are would be very helpful.
Go ahead, absolutely.
A visualization of them would be really great, and I've got a few papers that people can look at, and there's some really great photos that show that. But pretty much nanowire networks are tiny, tiny, tiny wires made out of metal, so small that you need very strong microscopes to even see them. So they're between 2 and 9 nanometers wide, and they're a few micrometers long. So they're significantly longer, so you can see the length, but you can't really see the width of them. They're about 1,000th of a hair width, something like that. And so why do we even care about nanowire networks? What's interesting about them? Well, they happen to portray neuromorphic properties. And what do I mean by that? I mean that at the tiny, minuscule nanoscale level, whenever electronics and particles do weird things, and there's some really interesting behavior that happens there. So what we see in nanowire networks is that, first of all, they're made out of metal, a silver conducting metal. And we coat them in a special plastic polymer, which is non-conducting, or it's almost like the opposite of conducting. And so when electricity is put into metal, it sort of just propagates around the metal and highly conducting and just kind of is sort of like spreads out. But because we have that cover, that kind of plastic cover, which is actually quite similar to, if you imagine in nerves or neurons, a myelin sheath or a synapse or something like that, the electricity doesn't really travel well through that plastic section. So nanowire networks, we put them on a glass substrate or a microchip or something like that, and they self-assemble, they spread out on their own, and they sort of cross over each other. They interlink over each other. And the way they look is quite reminiscent of neural networks in the brain. And so what happens is whenever a wire crosses over another wire, you get metal, they cross over each other. And in between there, you have the two layers, the insulating layers. And so we pump electricity into that, or we input an electrical signal into the network, and it goes through one of the metal wires. Whenever it intersects with another wire, we see this really interesting behavior at the nanoscale of little atoms or ions starting to migrate, kind of almost like building a bridge through that gap. Very similar to like neurotransmitters through a synapse, something like that. It's quite an amazing behavior because you wouldn't see that at a larger scale. It only happens at this nanoscale. And what's really interesting about that is that it's this kind of bridge is formed, and it also decays once you take electricity out. So the bridge is formed from one wire to another wire, and then the signal continues to be propagated through the network like that. But then when you get rid of electricity, the bridge decays, and so those pathways sort of stop. The electricity stops flowing, or current stops flowing through these wires. But that's not a linear relationship. It's a non-linear relationship. So you get these really cool emergent kind of properties or really interesting behaviors that aren't predictable. They're non-linear. We cannot really predict them from that kind of activation. And now, so to answer the question, sorry, it's a long introduction to be able to answer the question. The ability to then exhibit memory occurs because of these bridges being formed, or these pathways being formed between wires. And so once a bridge is formed, or once the ions fully migrate through and electricity is passed from one wire to another, I said it's sort of formed, and we think of it as like a switch turning on. It's like that section is on. And after a while, we stop that signal, and it begins to decay. But if we start the signal again, it's much quicker for that pre-activated pathway to turn back on than a non-activated pathway, than a wire that hasn't been previously activated. And so in that sense, we have memory for previous activations and previous pathways. So that's sort of like a short-term memory behavior. But what's really interesting is if you activate it enough times, and so we see short-term memory where we activate it at quite high frequencies for quite a short duration. We see that the memory for that previous interaction or activation. When we space out the activation over a longer time, we see that kind of decay rate, well, the junctions decay at a slower rate, and it's much easier then to reactivate them in the long term. So that's on an individual wire level. Now imagine thousands of them interacting at the same time. We start to get kind of network behaviors or activation. So we see this kind of conductance dramatically shift. The conductance of the network, which is the opposite of the resistance. So the resistance of the wires drops dramatically, and the conductance gets very high, meaning the capacity to conduct current or electricity. We see a dramatic increase in that at a certain level, a certain time point, where pretty much there's a pathway formed from where you put in the electricity to where you're grounded, or where your drain electrode is, where the electrode that kind of takes the electricity out of the system. There's a pathway of wires connecting, building these bridges to the next one and next one and next one. And we then see, once that whole network is kind of connected, it's kind of like a short little pathway. We see a huge increase in conductance, and that's also a non-linear activation. So we see memory both of the network, on the network level, and on the individual junction level. It's quite a complex thing to try and visualize and understand. Hopefully, I've covered it sufficiently. But if there's any questions you might have.
A million questions, of course, but I think you've done a fantastic job of getting that across. I don't have the scientific knowledge, of course, to query that in great detail, but one of the things I would ask is, how much of this looks like a human brain, or how much of it, how much are we projecting that? I mean, because it sounds quite close to what I understand to be the wetware of a human brain. But again, I don't have the scientific knowledge to query that in great detail. But so how, you yourself, what's your take on this? Is this very close to a human brain? Or is it, are we seeing patterns in clouds? Are we perhaps being a bit poetic about this?
I think it's somewhere in between. I think neuromorphic nanowire networks specifically mimic the synaptic kind of behavior, the neurons and the synapses, mainly the synapses that we see in brains, in terms of the insulating layers between the wires, almost being, I'd say, very highly analogous to synapses. The structure as well of these wires seems to be very, very similar. We get something called recurrence, which is where most of the network is kind of connected to itself in feedback loops, which we don't really see unless it's the most complicated AI models around. And that also seems to be quite important for memory, right, in a different way, which I don't really fully understand myself, but it's, something that we seem to see. That being said, it's important to consider all the other structures that are in the brain that we don't have the capacity to even start mimicking. So there's lots of different cells, glial cells, different types of neurons that don't even, have different types of synapses, interneurons, things like that, which we haven't even began to conceive of. We also don't really have a full understanding of how the nanowire networks work, to the extent of we don't know if there's any kind of capacitive behavior or battery-like behavior, like some kind of energy storage that might occur. We think there's something like that. There's also my colleague Joel Hochstetter, who's at Cambridge University now. He wrote a paper in Nature Communications about criticality of the network, and he showed that there's something called electron tunneling. It's sort of like some kind of quantum behavior of tunneling. So wherever these atoms kind of start bridging between the wires, it doesn't always have to be that we have to wait till it's fully bridged, right, before the electricity can keep going. There's also sort of jumps or tunneling, quantum tunneling behavior, electron tunneling, which allows for random kind of activation of certain pathways, which, we have some kind of understanding of, but nowhere near an in-depth understanding. That being said, I'd imagine that we don't really understand that in the brain either. So that's also a nice analogy to the brain. But I think these are really great systems to try and ask and tackle the fundamental questions of the physical nature of what makes a brain and what makes us intelligent, conscious, what starts, is there any evidence for memory or learning in these small structures that might, if we get them big enough and we get them modular enough and we add the right type of cells and stuff like that, we'd be able to see intelligent behavior or conscious behavior.
Not so much that you're building a fake brain, it's just that a brain could be a brain whether it's built out of wetware or the materials that you're using. As you said, what makes a brain?
I think so. I mean, nature has a few billion years head start over us. And we don't really fully understand, why our brains are even in the structure that it is. And we're talking about two dimensions here, like the brain's in a three-dimensional object. So there's lots of things that we still need to catch up on. But, this is a very good start to asking those questions and hopefully finding some answers.
But you're already seeing cognitive function, is that right, in some of these things? So what does that mean? What does it mean when you're seeing cognitive function in these things?
Yeah, you might be thinking, they're thinking and they're it might be a bit scary. People always ask me is this the start of the Terminator or the Matrix? Absolutely not. I'd like to make that very clear. Maybe a few years down the line, but not at the moment. When we say cognitive function, we mean the precursors for something that might look like intelligence. So there's not really a clear definition of intelligence, but we like to think that humans are intelligent to at least some extent, creatures. And what we prescribe our intelligence to is adaptability, the ability to sort of adapt to the environments in which we're in, which pretty much can be broken down into amazing capacity to learn and learn broadly as well as specifically. So we can learn very general things, and we can also become very, very amazingly specific at something. Can be an amazing chess player or pianist or things like that, but you also know not to eat that berry and die in the woods. You can learn that pretty easily. You know what a cat is by the age of 2 pretty easy as well. So learning is a really, really important precursor to intelligence. Memory is another example. We've spoken about memory before. How could you possibly navigate an environment without remembering what happened last time you were in a similar environment, or, be able to project previous experiences into the future and predict from that? So we're looking for those kinds of clues and those kinds of processes in physical systems, non-biological systems. And so that's what we mean by cognitive function. We can exhibit, I explained a little bit about memory, how we show these kind of memories. And when I say memory, these wires can't picture, what happened to them in the past like we can. But they have, inherently built into the system, they can remember previous activations of pathways. They react in different ways for things that they've seen before to things that they haven't seen before. And that's sort of what's happening at the very fundamental basic block of our brains as well. In terms of learning, we've shown in a couple of our papers the amazing capacity to learn under a few different, paradigms that we've incorporated into this. So my most recent paper, I've shown that they can learn in similar ways that the brain does. So the brain learns in a few different ways. We have something called reinforcement learning, which on the outside world behavioral scale is, if I touch this fire and it hurts, that kind of is a bad thing, and it's like punishes me. Whereas if I eat this cake, it's delicious, so I want to eat it more. That's a positive reinforcement. That also happens in a neuron by neuron case. So if I fired and good things have happened because of that, I get good neurotransmitters or dopamine or whatever, I will most likely want to fire again. And so we see these kind of activities in nanowire networks, or we've trained them to be able to do something like that. So what do I mean? I mean that we have the capacity to control the pathways that the wires choose to go through. Well, directed to go through. So I mentioned before, it sort of goes from where you feed in the electricity to where you've kind of got the ground where the electricity comes out of the network. We found a way to actually direct it away from that if we want to. Or if we have multiple of those grounded electrodes, we can choose which one we want the network to move through. And that's, quite a exciting thing, because it shows that, first of all, we can direct the network. Second of all, they can learn. And third of all, they can remember what we've taught it, right? So these are some key fundamental cognitive precursors to cognitive function that we can see in these wires. And it's quite an exciting thing.
I can imagine it is. So let's say that you've built a synthetic brain, let's call it a synthetic brain, and it has cognitive function, and it has the ability to make and retain memories and draw on those memories. What are the practical applications of that synthetic brain? I mean, it sounds like we're talking about thinking robots here.
I wish. That would be really nice. Maybe kind of scary, but really a fun thing to explore. I think the more realistic applications still rest in the power reduction space of neuromorphics. So being able to process big data in a much reduced amount of power, significantly reduced power requirements. I think in terms of cognitive functions and exhibiting those kind of things, we're getting a bit more into, the kind of what if space, or like the sci-fi kind of potential applications. I think one really important factor, which I don't think I've mentioned yet, is something that my supervisor, Professor Zdenko Kuncic, is very interested in, and that's the applicability of neuromorphic systems such as nanowires to be used for online learning. And what do I mean by online learning? I mean being able to take in information about an environment, process that information, learn on the fly, on the actual chip itself. It doesn't have to communicate to the cloud, anything like that. It's called edge processing, or on the edge processing, or learning, or I can't remember the exact terminology. But and the ability for the wires to do that is possible because of these precursors for cognitive function that we've discussed. And so it's quite exciting to think of something like, maybe if you put it in like a deep sea exploration of a drone or something like that, which has no access to the internet, has to record for weeks and weeks on end and can't do any real processing of the data it sees until we recover it, right? For even, a space probe, something like that, we need to constantly connect to it and relay, and that's quite difficult to do. But if it's learning by itself on the fly, and it's, it has these kind of memory capacities, has these learning capacities, and we can really hone in onto those and make use of them, there's no need for us to check in with these systems. There's no need for it to communicate with us. It's just doing the processing on its own. And then all it has to do is send us the data that's being processed. And so it opens up really exciting, applications for deep space exploration, deep sea exploration, even, just like surveying, of like environmental areas. Like if we want to track stuff like weather or deforestation, things like that, with drones or cameras, it's sort of something that can happen in real time, and we don't have to constantly be communicating with these systems. If they're lost, we don't lose all the data, things like that. That's quite a realistic and probably quite soon application of this technology. If we want to go much deeper into sci-fi and what might this be used for, if we can unlock combinations of these chips and networks. I said they're like two-dimensional, they're quite small, only a few thousand of these nanowires and connections. If we can somehow find a way to combine them in hierarchical modules, or, each little section or each little chip has a different function that's trained to be done, it's very possible that we could have some very, very, primitive brain-like system where each section is responsible for a different sense or a sensor or whatever it is that we apply to it. I'm talking, way down the line here. Lots more research needs to be done into this, but those are the kind of questions that I've been thinking about, and throughout my PhD really was really interested in. And actually the kind of questions that I'm bringing towards my current job, which is a different area, but very, very relevant, where in my current job, I'm working with real neurons, not, neuromorphic systems. But, those are the kind of questions which might sound scary to some, but I don't think, if we want to get into the, the ethics of it and the potential Terminator possibilities and stuff like that, I think I'm quite an optimist. We're seeing quite a lot of people in this space, in the AI space, sort of saying, let's slow down, this is getting really scary. I tend to agree with them to the extent I'm not an expert in AI, but I tend to believe in them and listen to them, and maybe it's time to sort of shift our attitude towards AI and move more towards something like biologically inspired systems, because, we don't really say that humans are horrible in general. There's no kind of like inherent badness in humanity. the individual or the circumstances of the environment, all these kind of features are what shapes a person. And so why should that be any different with a system or a technology? And so if we can, shift our thinking towards, let's try and apply more human-like AI, more human-like systems, then we can start thinking about that in terms of a bit less kind of, this is going to kill us all, and more like, well, maybe we need to regulate how it's used. Maybe we need to talk about who's the person behind, who gets to control it. I don't think it'll ever get to the state, maybe not ever. I don't want to say, I never want to say ever, but I don't think for a long time we'll get to a stage where this kind of technology will become human-like, like actually human-like. But as you said, we may find that we don't need human-like biology, structure and function in order to create some intelligent system. And the intelligence might look very different. So I think that's really exciting stuff. That's very potential, I don't know if it's in our lifetime, maybe. I think this area is gaining slowly a lot more interest. And with more interest comes more funding and more research and more people. And so I think we'll get to a stage in our lives in the next, hopefully 5 to 10 years, where this starts exploding, this brain-inspired computing and research. All the big companies are looking at it, at least to some extent. And so
I do hope that, the next 5 to 10 years is within our lifetime, Alan. So, you've actually answered one of the questions I was going to put there about ethics, but let me ask you another question. Are the right questions around ethics being asked of the right people and then pursued for a proper answer, which is then put under proper scrutiny? Basically, are we having the right conversations around ethics?
Look, I'm still an early career researcher, and I've moved into the industry space still as a researcher. So I don't want to, stand here and presume that I know everything. I probably know nothing. And there's a lot smarter people than me who probably also would say they don't know much or enough about this space. I think that, a lot of people, as I said before, a lot of my friends, a lot of my family are really worried about the implications of AI and the ethics behind it. I like to have an optimistic approach and the benefit of the doubt. I think these questions that are being asked, we're only starting to see impact of those questions being asked. It's sort of like before, it was just like, oh, this is kind of scary, what's the potential impact, but no real oomph to it, no real substance to it. But I think governments around the world and, research communities and companies are starting to really take a step back and say, okay, maybe there is some serious, harmful potential for these systems in terms, and it can be asked it can be on a number of levels. One is the harm that could potentially be done to humanity or the earth or individual people. And the other is, are these systems in any way intelligent enough to feel harm, themselves? I don't think we're anywhere near that second perspective. Maybe, in the field of big data and generative models, we'll find a different pathway into this kind of intelligence or a different type of intelligent system that might start having some kind of self-awareness or understanding of existing. I'd be very surprised if that happens, but I'm not closed to that concept. And in terms of, actually mimicking brains and building brains, I think we're too far to even start considering the ethical, implications of harming these kind of devices. But these are the kind of questions that need to be asked. And I think there's probably a bunch of different perspectives on it that I haven't even thought of or covered. But, the rudimentary questions of, are we harming anyone? Are we harming the system itself? Can this system be used by anyone to do harm? I know we're focusing a lot on harm because, humans can be very harmful, as we've seen across history. but humans can also do a lot of good, and a lot of the ethical questions that, stem from our experiences and, in philosophy seem to focus a lot on this dichotomy, right? And I think a lot of the questions that we're focusing on these systems seems to be more down the line of harm and down the line of, is there an issue with this? And maybe we need to start philosophizing a bit more about this space, maybe, brain inspired or neuromorphic philosophy could be a field that starts emerging.
Well, there we go. Do you think that perhaps we do need as much psychology and philosophy and perhaps spiritualism in the discussion as much as we do the hard, cold technology? Certainly, I've been hearing people talking about the hubris of scientists, and nobody's taking faith or religion into these matters. For one thing, I'd hate to be the AI that is on a deep space probe that's spending another millennia with an awareness. It's bad enough being the AI on a deep sea probe in all that inky blackness. But yeah, if we're sending a self-aware chip into the depths of interstellar space, I'm not volunteering for that job. That's not me.
That does sound kind of quite nihilistic and depressing to picture that. Yeah. That's something that I haven't really thought of. So thanks for bringing up that picture. It is a scary thought. I think that, as I said, the technologies that we're developing now won't have that capacity. They won't be able to think that way. And I'm saying this blanket wise, but I don't, there's always space to be surprised, and we don't know anything. As you said, scientists seem to think that they have the cold, calculated answers to everything. But humanity in history has created other forms of knowledge and other forms of, philosophy and psychology and, through the arts and through spiritualism and through all this kind of spaces, which I think, at least to the extent of borrowing inspiration from these fields in our research, is absolutely essential. I don't think I'd be where I am if I didn't look back at my psychology and my philosophy in my own hard science. To the same extent, I definitely wouldn't be where I am without the hard science. But, it's very important to constantly look for inspiration from these things, because there's a reason culture developed. There's a reason arts developed. There's a reason religion came about. And those reasons aren't necessarily as obvious as people, scientists might seem to think. There's entire fields dedicated to this and countless PhDs have been done on this. So I think it's really, really important to not lose track of that, and to, if there's any way to even implement that in the kind of AI systems that we're building or brain-inspired systems that we're building, creativity might be another one of those precursors to intelligence. We don't know, we don't know enough about that. It might be that you need these kinds of ways of thinking and borrow from these different fields in order to get the full picture of what we're trying to build. So I think that's a really, really important question and point, which a lot of people, I don't think, are really thinking about.
One of my takes on all of this is that popular culture is often a mirror as much as a playbook. And so can you tell me what films have you seen about AI or computer brains or computer thinking that have either annoyed you because they're so inaccurate or have made you think, that's something that should be looked into? What's your take on that?
I think, as sci-fi goes, which is one of my favorite fields of reading and watching as well, you can't really be inaccurate in a sense because it's fiction, and it's as real as our thinking is real, or our creativity is real. In terms of the realism of being able to actually reproduce some of these movies, I can definitely answer that. I think one of my favorite movies of all time is Deus Ex Machina. I don't know if you've seen it. highly recommend it. Definitely go and see it. It should be on Netflix or something like that. People should have access to it. And I think, it's about like an AI system or robot that's kind of locked underground, and I won't spoil it, but it sort of asks questions about how human is this system really, and those kind of questions. Are we close to these kind of robots that are thinking? Is that something that's realistic and reasonable? I think if that is something that is going to happen, that movie is a really cool exploration of that. And it probably could look something like that. Other books and movies in the sci-fi space that I'm a big fan of are like, the Asimov series, Foundation series, iRobot series. I think they're probably a little bit more towards the kind of fictional space. I mean, they definitely focus more on like space exploration and human expansion and cultural kind of underpinnings of that, which is fascinating in itself, but maybe a little indirect in that sense. I think one of my favorite books of all time, which also I highly recommend people read, is The Three-Body Problem by Liu Cixin. It's a trilogy. It's a fantastic, fantastic book. And it sort of explores over many, many, many centuries the potential for extraterrestrial life and what that might look like, and questions about, how would we exist in a universe that has other types of intelligences. And I think that really kind of wraps nicely to what we were talking about before, and something that you mentioned, which I thought was really, really interesting, is, we as humans are the only intelligence that we know of. I personally think that animals, or most organisms, are intelligent or have at least some aspect of intelligence, but let's just say that humans are the only, the main organism in the universe, the known universe, that is intelligent. But there's nothing to say that there aren't other types of intelligence out there, different types of swarm intelligences, or, bacterial, maybe there's some bacterial colonies that somehow form some kind of intelligence. I know this might seem a bit kooky and far-fetched, but it's all stuff that's worth thinking about and exploring. And I think, the three-body problem asks us the question of, we think we're so amazing and we're the only ones, and, what happens when we're faced with a potentially much more advanced civilization, or a whole infinite series of advanced civilizations. Again, I don't want to spoil it too much, but, these kind of questions, these are the questions that I think scientists should be exploring and thinking about, and, definitely watching these kind of movies and consuming these kinds of content, because as far-fetched and outlandish as it might seem, it forms a way of thinking, and you never know what kind of threads jump at you while you're watching the movie, or if you're in the shower thinking about the book that you just read, and you're like, oh, that's actually, similar to this scientific concept. Maybe I should explore that. So I think there's definitely space for that, and it should be things that people endeavor to do as well.
It's great. It's great looking at it. Popular culture came from a synaptic spark just as much as any scientific endeavor came from a synaptic spark. So it's not to be ignored. Now, this has all been fantastic. And I guess on the popular culture side, we're seeing The Three-Body Problem, anything by Asimov, and anything by Alex Garland, it sounds like, as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's countless number. I have, I'm looking up at my book collection up here. There's so many different amazing authors and storytellers that I would very much, recommend people to explore that kind of thing. In terms of nonfiction as well, I don't know if you read Yuval Noah Harari stuff, the book Homo Deus and Sapiens. I think he paints a really cool cultural understanding, or looking back at history to try and project into the future. And he has some really fascinating points. I think he's one of the future that he's predicting is probably the closest to what's going to happen. And as maybe as sad or as somewhat depressing it might seem, even stuff like the children's movie WALL-E, has some really, really fascinating insights into what the world seems to be moving towards. As depressing as an Earth that's full of litter and garbage, and, it's just obese people floating around in space, drinking and eating, and all of their needs being met. It raises some really interesting questions about, where we're moving towards a society. And I'm not saying that, being obese is a bad thing. Yeah. And I'm not saying that, indulging in those kind of things is a bad thing. But, there's some big questions that it raises and some really interesting philosophical dilemmas that we should be looking at, from something as simple as what is a children's movie? Yeah.
This is something that's cropping up quite often, is that we need nuance and we need detail, and we don't need just, this is Skynet. We need more Wall-E and less Terminator. It does sound that way.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, Wall-E saves the day at the end, right? I mean, so does the Terminator, but I'd rather be in the Wall-E movie than the Terminator, I think.
Subscribe to the Hello Computer channel here on YouTube to hear more interviews with experts as the world comes to terms with thinking machines.